Today is Wednesday, August 23rd. This is VOA's International Edition. I'm Lori London in Washington. Coming up, President Trump holds a campaign rally in Arizona and again goes after the media.
Truly dishonest people in the media and the fake media. They make up stories. They have no sources in many cases.
Can America really have diplomacy without enough diplomats?
What if there is a problem in an important NATO ally like Germany and you don't have an ambassador there?
The AIDS epidemic, where things stand in the U.S. Also ahead, America loses a beloved legend of comedy. It's all on today's International Edition. Well, protesters engaged in minor scuffles and shouting matches with Donald Trump supporters Tuesday as hundreds of people lined up to get inside a rally that marks his first political event since the violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, Phoenix, Arizona leaders were on high alert in the aftermath of the deadly protests and the president's comments last week about both sides having blame for violence at the white supremacist rally. Mayor Greg Stanton called on the president not to hold the rally so soon after the trouble in Charlottesville. But the rally went on as a defiant President Trump went after the media, saying he clearly denounced racism on multiple occasions.
In the media and the fake media, they make up stories. They have no sources in many cases. They say a source says there is no such thing, but they don't report the facts. Just like they don't want to report that I spoke out forcefully against hatred, bigotry, and violence, and strongly condemned the neo-Nazis, the white supremacists, and the KKK.
The rally follows a speech Monday night before U.S. troops and the way forward in Afghanistan. And joining me now to talk more about that speech on Monday, on the longest war in U.S. history and the president's new strategy, is Will Fisher, Director of Government Relations with the nonprofit organization Vote Vets, the largest progressive veterans organization in the U.S. with over 500,000 members. Will, what did you make of President Trump's speech on Afghanistan?
The speech that Donald Trump gave on Afghanistan was classic Donald Trump. It was low on substance, high on bombast, and entirely self-serving. I want to be crystal clear. The purpose of the speech was not to discuss a way forward in Afghanistan. The purpose on the speech was Donald, the sort of self-described ratings machine Trump, wanting to flip the script as any reality TV star would. Donald Trump's numbers are in a complete freefall, and they have been, especially in the wake of him equivocating on Nazis and on white supremacists. So what does he do? Calls together, the gang of sycophants to Camp David, calls Vice President Pence back early from an overseas trip and says, hey, we need a plot twist for a major character. That's what this speech was all about last night, to distract attention away from the fact that Donald Trump has proven himself to be, at best, a Nazi sympathizer.
Your group is under the impression that this was all something merely to change the conversation, but why are you drawing that conclusion? Is Afghanistan not a top priority at this moment in time?
It is, but Donald Trump's plan, if it can be called such a thing, was of no real substance and of no real change. Donald Trump could have saved us all a lot of time if he would have simply gone on to his favorite mode of communication and posted a photo of him kicking a can down the road and said, hey, everybody, look, it's my new policy on Afghanistan. There is not a military solution to Afghanistan. The solutions to Afghanistan are going to be found in political and democratic efforts, diplomatic efforts. Donald Trump saying that he's going to send more troops into Afghanistan.
He didn't say he was sending in more troops. He said he wasn't going to tell us what he was going to do with regard to that.
He did, but I think that if you look at some of his actions as it relates to diplomatic efforts and funding at the State Department, those are certainly going to be going by the wayside under a Trump administration. I think when you hear him talk about his desire to, quote-unquote, win with our military, he is suggesting that we're going to send more troops. Now, what I do not understand is how he could think that leaders would see that simply sending more troops into Afghanistan with no real plan is not a strategy for success.
You mentioned the motive being potentially to distract from all the talk about racism and the criticism that the president has been receiving. Do you think that that distraction worked?
No, I mean, look, I couldn't help but wonder last night sort of who was going to be the first person who, if Donald Trump managed to string a couple of sentences together with subject-verb agreement, would go on television and talk about how tonight Donald Trump became president or how presidential he was. We are not going to let Donald Trump just take attention away from the fact that he has equivocated with Nazis, he has equivocated with white supremacists. And when he's talking about Afghanistan, this is somebody who you never know where he's going to come down. A few months ago, according to him, Afghanistan was such a hotbed of terror that it required him dropping a Moab in Afghanistan, which is one of the largest pieces of artillery in our arsenal. Then a few weeks ago, he's not even sure that we should be there at all. Then last night, he's decided that he's going to write a blank check for combat operations in Afghanistan with no end in sight. This is also someone who speaks in a remarkably cavalier way about nuclear war with North Korea, who throws statements out like spin art when it comes to foreign policy, whether it's talking about invading Venezuela or so on and so forth. There is really nothing that shines brighter on the marquee of Donald Trump's capriciousness more than Donald Trump's policy as it relates to international affairs.
Will Fisher, Director of Government Relations with the nonprofit progressive organization Vote Vets, thanks for being with us. Well, on the heels of President Trump's speech on Afghanistan and talk of diplomacy as one big part of that strategy, there are questions about how to go about that there and in other places in the world that are fragile at the moment, as dozens of positions at the State Department remain unfilled or have been eliminated. Joining me now for more is former diplomat and former U.S. ambassador and current president of the East-West Institute, Cameron Munter. Thanks for being with us, sir. So, do you think the State Department is being dismantled to some degree?
It does seem that way. There are a number of slots for undersecretaries which have not been filled. There are a number of slots which are the assistant secretaries, the people who run the so-called regional bureaus. These are the people who really make policy. These are the close advisors to the secretary in a normal State Department. And what's puzzling to people like me who've worked in that world, whether or not there's been Democrats or Republicans, these people are the people trained in diplomacy, especially the career people, but also the political people who come in. They're trained in a mechanism which is part of a worldwide mechanism which allows countries to deal with one another on things from climate change to nonproliferation to bilateral issues to political alliances. And so the feeling that one gets, and I'm as puzzled by this as anyone else, is that the leadership of the government, that is both the White House and perhaps even Mr. Tillerson, seem to think that changing the way, not changing the policy, but changing the way policy is made is something that's very necessary, and that they won't appoint people until those changes, those structural changes are made. The difficulty here is that there seems to be an assumption that what diplomats do, what they're trained to do, and how they do it, is somehow not as important as having different ideas. And again, the analogy that I struggle to find is, would you want someone who doesn't have a driver's license to drive a car? I'm not trying to say that the people who might come in would be inept. It's just that there are various skills that a diplomat has.
Do you think it's sort of a control thing that this administration just does not want anyone from any past administration? This whole loyalty thing we've heard a lot from this White House. Do you think that could have something to do with it? And does loyalty even play a role in this type of situation?
This, to me, is beyond loyalty. Every group that has come in, famously, Republicans turning over to Democrats, Democrats turning over to Republicans, initially they look at the State Department and say, these people worked for my predecessor. I just ran against my predecessor. And then they quickly realize that when you're trained to be a diplomat, you're serving the country, and you loyally and very carefully and very honestly serve the person who is your boss. That's your constitutional job. And very quickly, everyone I've worked with, and I worked in the Clinton White House and then went on to work in the Bush White House, they quickly realized that they have very valuable people who are going to give them honest, straightforward advice. There's another element to this, which is not just a domestic element, the way in which our country talks to third countries. Let's say there's an issue about missiles in North Korea or the war in Syria? Who talks to the German foreign ministry? It's the American diplomats.
Right,
Who talks to the Russian foreign ministry? Who talks to the Chinese? In other words, it's not just a question of addressing a problem. It's lateral communication around the world is carried out by diplomats. And if you don't have the people who are trained to do that, you can miss signals, you can fail to inform people, and it's very hard to convince other people to work with you if you haven't worked very hard at developing trust with foreigners and that they understand what you think. It's a question that makes people like me scratch my head about how does one propose in this administration to work with other countries if the people who speak the foreign languages and know the people in the foreign countries are not there to pass on those messages.
Besides the fact that we've got about 30% unfilled ambassadorships right now, there's also that push to eliminate some 2,300 jobs from the State Department budget. How concerned are you about what is happening at the State Department? What would appear to be it's being gutted to some degree?
Let's just try to look specifically at what happens when you don't have people in these jobs. There are many people at the State Department who are open-minded enough to say there are structural changes that could be made at the state that might be beneficial. For example, many career people have said, many career diplomats have said, we have too many special envoys, and maybe a special envoy for X or the special envoy for that doesn't need to be named. It can be that function can be folded back into the bureaus. Fine. I don't think everyone is against any change. But the two things about what you've said that I think are very important are ambassadorial posts that are left vacant give an impression to the country where they're vacant that that country doesn't matter. Now, one can argue that in the modern age, ambassadors are old-fashioned and we have modern communications, but most countries take the American ambassador very seriously. And if you don't have an ambassador, that is noticed by that country. And then there's not only the symbolism, but then secondly, there's the actual role. What if there is a problem in an important NATO ally like Germany and you don't have an ambassador there, or China? What is the mechanism by which you make sure that the leader of that country, that you know that we're really getting our message across and it's not going to be misunderstood? But if there's not a center, a place where the policies are discussed, debated, and communicated, what happens is it becomes a very diffuse world within which many people don't know which ideas are authoritative or not. And when you don't know what ideas are authoritative, it simply becomes confusing. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't want to think that in a situation where you have tensions like we do at the present with Russia or tensions over North Korea, I would really not want just a barrage of different opinions out there. I would like to think that people can say, well, at least the authoritative version from the State Department is this. And it's hard in some cases to find that when you haven't filled, staffed, and trusted the State Department.
All right, former ambassador and current president of the East-West Institute, Cameron Munter. Here are some of the stories we're following at voanews.com. Greenland ice sheet is yielding clues to climate change. The White House pays tribute to sailors lost in a collision at sea. Thousands of children are vaccinated in Syria's Raqqa amid a polio outbreak. And Los Angeles seeks to join the lawsuit over U.S. sanctuary policies. Find expanded coverage of these stories and much more at voanews.com and on our VOA mobile app. This is International Edition. Well, approximately 1 million people in the U.S. are living with HIV, and 1 in 7 of them don't even know it. But the number of infections has been on the decline, as activists now worry that progress could be reversed if government spending to programs they've benefited from go away. Ahead of a large U.S. conference on AIDS in September, we're joined by Murray Penner, Executive Director of the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. Thanks for being with us. So what is the state of AIDS today in the U.S.?
Well, substantial progress has really been made over the last 30-some years in responding to the epidemic, and we can really now, for the first time probably ever, talk about the end of AIDS. We have all of the tools that are necessary, or nearly all the tools that are necessary. We certainly have the knowledge and the understanding about what it takes to end the epidemic. And what we really need now is the political will in order to do so. So it's going to take resources, clearly. Knowing that we could reach the end, it really is a matter of resolve to figure out if we can get there.
What will it take to get there?
Clearly, one of the most important things related to ending the epidemic would be reducing new infections. We have biomedical interventions that clearly reduce new infections, including treatment of HIV. And what we now know through various studies is that if individuals can achieve an undetectable viral load to where they have virus in their body, but that virus is not active, we can clearly demonstrate that there are no infections that result. Mm-hmm. The second piece is for people who are HIV negative, there is an intervention called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP, and that is all about preventing new infections by also taking an antiretroviral medication. Just like somebody who's HIV positive takes medication, an individual who is negative, if they take the currently approved medication for PrEP, it is really a very low chance of becoming HIV positive as a result of HIV exposure.
I understand that there's a big meeting coming up with AIDS advocates and the Presidential Advisory Council. I know that this past June, a number of those advisors resigned from that council in protest. They accused the president of not caring enough about HIV issues. And this would be, I'm assuming, the first time the council has met since the resignations. What do you expect from this?
They are meeting August 30th here in Washington, D.C. I expect that the council will continue the resolve forward in recommending to the president that we continue the focus on working towards the end of the epidemic. I think that one of the clear, important messages is that we still have a lot of work to do. We still have some huge disparities in terms of who accesses health care and who can achieve undetectable viral load status, for instance. And so I think the resolve is that we really need ongoing HIV support. We need resources for that. We need a concerted effort towards achieving the national goals that have been put in place. And I think the council will stay resolved in that effort moving forward. There's also a meeting, a real important meeting coming up in September of many, many advocates coming together. It's the U.S. Conference on AIDS, and I expect that will be a similar push. What we really need to see from an appropriation standpoint is Congress continuing to maintain their appropriations for HIV, funding the Ryan White program, other necessary services, and we are pleased that Congress continues to move in that direction.
With the new fiscal year about to begin in another 2 months, Congress will need to pass some spending bills, continue funding important programs that would benefit people living with HIV/AIDS. How concerned are you that there could be spending cuts that could be harmful to the progress that's been made?
Very concerned. The president's budget proposed some very significant cuts to programs that provide important benefits to people living with HIV, including HOPWA, the National Institutes of Health, CDC, the Secretary's Minority AIDS Initiative Fund, and the Ryan White program. And if we were to see those funding cuts implemented, it really would devastate the entire HIV/AIDS infrastructure that's been built and put in place over much of the last 30 to 35 years. And so as Congress continues their work, as you mentioned, towards the funding for fiscal year 18, we really need to see funding levels maintained, and actually some of the cuts that were actually put in place in 2017 restored. The Part C Ryan White HIV/AIDS program had a cut, and the CDC's STD prevention program, which is very closely related to HIV programming, those cuts need to be restored.
We haven't been hearing much lately about the Affordable Care Act. It seems for now it's staying in place, although there has been talk of the president cutting funding for it, which would probably create quite a few problems. How would this impact benefits people receive for HIV/AIDS?
The health care coverage is critical for people living with HIV. It really is time for us to come to some kind of a bipartisan solution that protects and improves the health care of all Americans, including those living with HIV. We can't keep playing politics with people's lives.
All right, that's Murray Penner, Executive Director of the National Alliance of State and Territorial AIDS Directors. Thanks for being with us. This is International Edition on VOA.
Hi, this is Victor Beattie, Managing Editor of VOA News. Tune in to the Voice of America's newscasts every hour on the top of each hour, 24/7. Listen to our news and correspondent reports from around the world. VOA is your trusted source for news and information.
Well, the world's worst smelling, scratch that, checking out what's trending on social media. We're joined by VOA's Andrew Palczewski. Hey, Andrew, what's happening?
Well, a couple days after the big solar eclipse here in the U.S., it is still the talk of social media.
Wow.
And people are talking about what a big reaction it got on social media. According to Facebook, 66 million people talking about the eclipse while it was going on. That created 240 million interactions, more than 365 million video views on Facebook. So big stuff. Lots of people talking about this on Facebook. Twitter as well, more than 6 million tweets during the eclipse. So lots of conversation going on. But not everyone had their face in digital media. Case in point, Netflix posted on their social media accounts that they actually had a 10% drop in video plays during the hours of the eclipse. Which is pretty big news because, A, Netflix doesn't like to reveal a lot of information about its ratings.
Particularly when they're not being watched.
Exactly. And B, the fact that they're not being watched and they're publicizing that is pretty bizarre. But it just speaks to how many people put down their phones, took their eyes away from the television screen, and actually looked up at the sky to see this pretty amazing sight.
I think just with all the news and the tension in the country right now, I think it was a really beautiful distraction and also sort of a way to step out of the day-to-day things that we stress over and realize just, the miracle of this planet and the universe and how all of it is so insignificant comparatively.
Yeah, that's the sentiment we saw in about 140 characters or so on Twitter. But a lot of people in saying that exact thing, that it was nice to look around and see everybody gathered outside looking up at the sky. They said it was actually, one person I saw said it was the polar opposite of what was going on in Charlottesville last week, where you had the protest there and a lot of division and hatred. This, with the eclipse, was everybody coming together and unified, looking up at the sun. So it was actually a pretty cool thing, and social media certainly reflected that.
And it was free.
And it was free, even better.
Yes, absolutely. So anything else folks are talking about right now? Yeah,
this is an interesting story out of the U.S. state of New Hampshire. We talk about a lot of the bad stuff that goes on social media. So when there's a good story, I always like to highlight it. And this is a good story. So a woman in New Hampshire was in her swimming pool in her backyard, and she tried to get out, and the ladder for the swimming pool broke. So she was stuck in her swimming pool, and she was unable to pull herself out.
Ooh.
So what does she do? She very quickly and very smartly thinks of trying to grab at her iPad, which is on the lawn chair right near the pool. So she has a stick there. She kind of shimmies the chair over, gets the iPad, and she puts up a post on a Facebook group for her community saying, "Hey, I'm stuck in my pool. Can somebody help me out?" And within minutes, somebody saw that. They were able to come over and help her out of her pool. So it was a really great use of social media and crowdsourcing to help this woman out. And I don't want to think about what would have happened if she had gotten stuck in that pool and couldn't get out. But the fact that she was able to use digital media to do so was a pretty neat story, and shows that despite all the bad stuff that happens on social media, sometimes there are these good stories where it's put to good use.
All right, Andrew, we appreciate it. You can follow him on Twitter at @apal. And turning now to what's happening in Hollywood, we're joined by Rare.us content editor Nicole Moschella. Hey, Nicole. Wow, we lost an American comedy legend this week.
Yes, it was a pretty hard loss on Sunday. America lost Jerry Lewis, a comedian and actor who's been in a lot of people's lives over a decades-long career. He died in his Las Vegas home at the age of 91, surrounded by his family. And on Tuesday, an official cause of death was released by the Nevada coroner's office. He died of ischemic cardiomyopathy, which is essentially the narrowing of blood vessels around the heart, which causes the heart to not be able to pump blood through the body anymore. An official autopsy will not be performed on Jerry Lewis as he was under a doctor's care. Apparently, this condition comes from coronary artery disease. But he is remembered by many of his colleagues in Hollywood. Celine Dion, Ellen DeGeneres, Jim Carrey, William Shatner, and Patton Oswalt were all quick to take to social media to share their condolences, and I'm sure this is a loss that a lot of people are going to feel at this time.
For sure, for sure. He really had a huge impact on so many people on so many levels, of course, with his generosity with nonprofits and children and his hilarity.
Yeah.
And you've got an update on the hot and heavy romance with Jennifer Lopez and baseball star Alex Rodriguez. What's the deal?
Yes, they are continuing to keep things spicy. They were spotted at Alex's new gym that he just opened up in Miami, Florida, and they did a little bit of a couples workout together. I guess you could say that those who sweat together stay together. They did a little bit of sparring, which J-Lo is super into now that she's gotten her little gig on Shades of Blue, her television series here. And afterwards, they enjoyed a dinner at a local Miami restaurant with A-Rod's daughters, Natasha and Ella. So things are looking pretty good between the two of them. It's definitely a whirlwind romance, and they make one good-looking couple.
They sure do, for sure. Can't argue with that. All right, Nicole. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to International Edition. That does it for today, but find us anytime at voanews.com. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to our director, Tracy Carter, and our engineer, Daryl Smith. I'm Lori London in Washington. Have a wonderful day.
Next, an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.
The governments of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States welcome the recent announcement by the Libyan National Army, or LNA, that it will investigate reports of unlawful killings in Benghazi. The LNA has recognized the arrest warrant by the International Criminal Court prosecutor for a member of the LNA, Major Mahmoud Mustafa Boussaif al-Warfali, and has suspended him pending an investigation. The United States calls on the LNA to ensure that the investigation is carried out fully and fairly, and those responsible for the unlawful killings are held to account. Al-Warfali, a senior Libyan military commander, stands accused by the International Criminal Tribunal judges of personally shooting or ordering the execution of 33 people who were either civilians or injured fighters in at least 7 incidents in 2016 and 2017. Major al-Warfali is loyal to strongman Khalifa Haftar, a former general under longtime dictator Muammar Gaddafi. Haftar heads the most powerful military in Libya, and his forces recently managed to retake Benghazi after a 3-year campaign against other militant groups. The U.S. is monitoring ongoing acts of conflict in Libya closely. Those suspected of committing, ordering, or failing to prevent unlawful killings and torture on all sides must be fully investigated and held accountable. The U.S. and its allies will continue efforts at the international level to pursue appropriate action against those who are complicit in violations of international human rights law or international humanitarian law, whatever their affiliation. It is in Libya's interest to be able to rely on unified security forces responsible for the country's security and acting within the framework of Libya's laws and respecting international law. The governments of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States also reaffirm their support for the Government of National Accord. We underscore the importance of the United Nations' central role in facilitating Libyan-led political dialogue, welcome the appointment of the new Special Representative of the Secretary-General Ghassan Salamé, and look forward to supporting his efforts to facilitate a political solution in Libya.
That was an editorial reflecting the views of the United States government.